Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first ever autoimmune newscast addressing a question so many of us in the autoimmune community have been asking. Should I get the COVID-19 vaccine? I am Lily Stairs, founder and principal of Patient Authentic and interim CEO with the American Autoimmune Related Diseases Association, also known as AARDA. For nearly 30 years, AARDA has been the nation's leading advocate for the millions of people affected by autoimmune diseases in areas of education, public awareness, advocacy, and research. It's safe to say that this past year has been unlike any other, and as the leading national organization focused on autoimmune diseases, AARDA has been collaborating with top medical professionals and patient advocates to provide guidance for autoimmune patients as they navigate the COVID-19 pandemic. On that note, I'm so excited to kick off our autoimmune newscast made complete with an impressive lineup of medical professionals and patient advocates with us today to speak about the COVID-19 vaccine and what it means for those of us living with autoimmune disease. It is my honor to introduce Captain Janelle Ruth. She is the co-deputy of the CDC's COVID-19 Vaccine Task Force Implementation Unit. She has an impressive background, having practiced pediatric HIV and general tropical medicine in Malawi with the Baylor International Pediatric AIDS Initiative and worked in numerous roles across the CDC before transitioning to her current work in the Division of Viral Diseases. Dr. Ruth, thank you so much for being with us today amidst what I'm sure is a very, very busy schedule with the vaccine rollout happening as we speak.
Thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here.
So let's jump right in. Today, you're going to really talk to us about some of the vaccines that are out and on the market, and we're going to talk about some of the safety and efficacy. So I think one of the big questions that we're hearing, mRNA vaccines, it's a new technology. So can you tell us a bit more about how they work?
Sure, happy to. So you're absolutely right. They are new technology, but I want to emphasize that they're not unknown. These vaccines have been studied for more than a decade now. So the mRNA vaccines use a process that teaches our cells how to make a harmless piece of what we call the spike protein. And that spike protein is found on the surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's the little knobs that stick out from the surface of the virus. These mRNA vaccines really take advantage of a process that our cells use to make proteins, and they harness this system to make that spike protein. After the protein piece is made, that mRNA instruction piece actually gets destroyed, so it doesn't stay in the cell. And then our immune system can actually make antibodies against that spike protein. Once those antibodies are made, they stay in our system, and when we're exposed to the virus, they can then bind to the spike protein and protect us against COVID-19 disease. Maybe I'll mention just a few key things about these vaccines. One, like all vaccines in the United States, they have been rigorously tested for safety before being authorized for use. Second, these mRNA vaccines do not contain a live virus, so they don't carry a risk of causing disease in the person that's been vaccinated. And finally, that mRNA instruction piece never enters the nucleus of our cells where our own DNA is found, so it does not affect or interact with that DNA. I know that's been a concern for some people, so I want to emphasize that that RNA molecule really does get broken down quite quickly.
Yes, that's a great point. I'm really glad that you flagged that because we've had a number of folks, as they were registering for this newscast, ask that very question. So thank you for sharing and breaking that down. That was really helpful. So could you tell us a bit more about the clinical trials for the COVID-19 vaccines and elaborate, are they safe? Are they effective?
So Lily, I'll answer those first two questions right up front. They are safe and they are effective. So as many may know, 2 vaccines have now received an emergency use authorization, or an EUA, as I'll refer to it, after careful FDA review. The first is Pfizer, which is made by a company called BioNTech, which is a 2-dose regimen given at least 21 days apart. And the second is Moderna, which is another 2-dose regimen given at least 28 days apart. Both vaccines were tested in tens of thousands of adults. I think Pfizer had 45,000 adults enrolled in their trial, and Moderna had 30,000. These adults came from diverse backgrounds, so there were older adults and communities of color included in these clinical trials. Data from both clinical trials demonstrated that each vaccine was approximately 95% effective in preventing COVID-19 disease, and both had favorable safety profiles after the trials were complete. I think, both vaccines were really scrutinized for safety across the whole length of the trials, and really no concerning safety signals were noted for either one. The safety data, again, was reviewed by the FDA before they made that authorization, and it also gets reviewed by an organization called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which is hosted by CDC and makes recommendations about vaccines for the general public. They also review that safety data and found it favorable to move forward with recommendations.
Thanks, Dr. Ruth. And I'll add, as somebody who's worked in clinical trials for quite a long time, I have to say the scale of these clinical trials were massive. I mean, really did test a number of folks with the vaccine. And so I think that really does lend itself to this idea that it has been tested in a lot of folks. And that's something that we should think about as being really reassuring.
Yeah.
So we know that many members of our community have expressed concern surrounding the speed of the vaccines becoming available. And so could you talk to us a bit about how these vaccines were fast-tracked so quickly while still ensuring safety?
Yes, definitely have been hearing that comment, not just from folks in your community, but I think across the nation. There have been concerns about the safety of these vaccines because both the new technology that we talked about, and also they had this appearance of coming onto the market quickly. But I would really like to reassure you that one of the reasons these vaccines were able to reach the market so quickly was that we were able to harness existing networks already in place to test these vaccines rather than starting from scratch, which often happens. We use these existing clinical trials networks that were already available and have been used to test other medical treatments and other vaccines to really quickly get these trials up and running. And I'll point out that another critical piece has been the investment in manufacturing, even before the efficacy data was published. The US government and vaccine manufacturers really did invest millions of dollars to scale up vaccine production while those clinical trials were still underway, greatly reducing then the amount of time between that vaccine authorization and our implementation. This is a really great financial risk to both the government and these companies. And this is why you don't see it done very often. But normally that investment in the scale up of manufacturing occurs only after you get the data suggesting that the vaccines are effective. But we did this at the same time because we knew the importance of getting these vaccines out. One other point is that these mRNA vaccines are also very faster and cheaper to produce than many of the vaccines we currently use because they're made of already sort of assembled pieces. They don't require something called cell culture, which we often have to use to make other vaccines, and that can take much more time. And maybe just one last point, I'll say that the FDA and CDC really did work incredibly hard to prioritize the review and approval of these vaccines, again, to get them out to the American public as soon as we could.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ruth. That is a great walkthrough and a number of really important examples as to why we were able to move so quickly on this. But again, while still absolutely ensuring safety. So thank you for that. And I think that this will be helpful for folks to both think about and to share. I encourage, share what you're learning from this newscast with others, because if you have the question, likely a lot of other people do. So another question, as we think about safety and longer term safety, what is the CDC doing to continue monitoring side effects and ensure vaccine recipient safety?
Yes, so the safety of these vaccines is really our top agency priority. And I can again say that these vaccines are being held to the same safety standards that we use for all of our routine vaccinations. We have existing systems that can help to really rapidly detect safety problems. And these systems have been scaled up for the COVID-19 vaccine introduction to really fully meet the needs. You know, this is unprecedented, right? We've all heard that word, but we've never seen mass vaccination on this scale before. And we've also introduced additional systems and data sources that we've developed to really further enhance our ability to collect that data. So I'll mention two briefly. One is a system called vSafe. So this is a new smartphone-based after vaccination health checker for people who have received COVID-19 vaccines. It uses text messaging and web surveys to check in with vaccine recipients after vaccination on a set schedule for up to a year after they receive the vaccine. Participants can report side effects either through texting or these web surveys, and any health problems that they've experienced after COVID-19 vaccination. And then if any are noted, vSafe has a mechanism that the recipient will receive a telephone follow-up call from CDC, and then we can take a report of any significant health impacts from the vaccine. I'll say that vSafe is voluntary. When you go for your vaccine, you should be offered to be enrolled in vSafe. And over 4 million people now have volunteered to participate in this program. So this is really going to create an enormous database to ensure that we continue to monitor the safety moving forward. We also have another system that's been in place for decades now, and that's called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS. And this is a national system that collects reports from healthcare professionals, vaccine manufacturers, and also the public of any adverse events that might occur after vaccination. Reports that appear to be unexpected, reports that we collect that seem to happen more sort of more often than we would expect, or reports that have unusual patterns, all get investigated by a team here at CDC. And if we need to, we can implement special studies to take those investigations further. Lily, if I may, could I just interject a minute? I do want to point out that side effects are a reality of these two COVID vaccines. And I do want to make sure that we give everyone the facts, because once you have the facts, you know what to expect, and it doesn't come as such a surprise. Most people will not have any side effects from these vaccines, but some will. They're usually mild and they last maybe 1 or 2 days. So some people may experience pain or swelling at the injection site. Maybe a small fever or chills, maybe a headache or back pain. These are generally worse after the second dose, but again, are mild and they tend to go away after 1 to 2 days. And I do want to point out, I even told my parents this, it's a sign that your body is actually making those antibodies that we talked about earlier. So it's a sign that the vaccination is working. It's doing what it's supposed to do.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you shared that, because I know sometimes people can be like, oh my gosh, what's happening to me? But that is what is supposed to happen. So it's right. Being prepared, having that knowledge ahead of time, I think is just so critical. I'll also share with you, so the audience knows, I actually had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Ruth speak a few weeks ago on a webcast for the transplant community on the COVID-19 vaccine. And she told us about vSafe at that point. And I have been telling everybody about it. I've been saying, oh, you're getting the vaccine, you have to sign up. And actually, Anna Lagasse, an advocate who will be joining us this afternoon, she got the vaccine and she was all signed up for vSafe, and said it's been a good experience, and definitely instilling a lot of confidence, right? That we're still keeping an eye on it and we're collecting all of this data. So for those of you who are going out there to get the vaccine, please do sign up for vSafe, because it's up to all of us to contribute, and so that we have this data pool. Okay, so now let's talk. We've talked about the vaccine and its makeup and how it works, but could you walk us through the distribution process? How does it work? And tell us a little bit more about how groups were prioritized.
Sure, happy to do that, Lily. So COVID-19 vaccines right now are being allocated on a pro rata basis, or sort of proportionally, by population out to the different states and territories. And we did this proportionality of distribution to ensure really a fair and equitable distribution across the whole of the United States. To dig a little bit deeper, so the distribution process really starts when a COVID-19 vaccine provider places an order into a system that is monitored right here at CDC. Those orders get sent out to the various vaccine providers, manufacturers, and they in turn then ship the vaccine. Pfizer actually ships directly to the vaccine provider, and Moderna goes through a centralized depot to ship the vaccine. So I guess that gives you a little sense of just that whole chain of how vaccine gets ordered, the orders get placed, and then the vaccine gets delivered to that provider who then administers it. I'll say that ACIP, as I mentioned earlier, that Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and CDC both have really endorsed guiding principles for the efficient distribution, as well as some jurisdictional flexibility, I'll say, for that COVID-19 vaccination program. So while the recommendations from ACIP came based on the principles of equity and disease severity in groups to select certain populations for early vaccine access, we've really given our states, our jurisdictions, the flexibility to administer this guidance in the best way that they see fit for their populations. So, we really do emphasize in the jurisdictions, it's not necessary to completely or fully administer vaccine to all eligible persons in one phase before they progress to the next phase. And certainly emphasize if there are extra doses that could expire, it's really acceptable to administer them to people who might be prioritized for a later phase. We don't want any vaccine doses to go to waste.
No, we definitely do not.
Yes. Demand and implementation challenges, I think, will vary also from one state to the next. So we know that jurisdictions are really going to move through these phases at different rates. It really depends on the state. I would say that most jurisdictions now really are moving into phase 1B vaccination, which prioritizes essential workers and older adults. But I would just say to the audience, please check with your state-specific website where you live to see where your state is in the rollout process, because it does vary from one to the next.
Yes, I think that's a great point. And will be, as part of our FAQs on our site, we will include a link where folks can go to find their state and then go ahead and look for what's happening and where can I go to book time to get vaccinated. So we'll be sure to have all of those resources right at your fingertips, available after our newscast. And so, Dr. Ruth, you've really covered so much in such a short period of time. This has just been so informational. I want to give you an opportunity to just share any final thoughts that you might have.
Sure, Lily, happy to. I guess I would start by saying this is really an exciting and a historic time as we see these first vaccine doses being given out to combat the pandemic. I think right now we have over 41 million Americans who have received at least one dose and over 16 who have been fully vaccinated. So, just again, an unprecedented effort to get this vaccine out. I'd also say our work is far from over. So we are going to continue to see challenges in this pandemic. I think we've all been hearing about the new variants that have been identified in the UK and in South Africa and then have moved their way here. We're also hearing, oh my goodness, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. When you're rolling live, you never know what's going to happen.
All right. Well, as long as you can still see me.
It's energy saving, right? A little bit less light.
There we go. So yes, new variants. And then also I did want to make a mention of vaccine hesitancy, because I know these are challenges that we're working very hard here at CDC to combat. We're definitely having new vaccines on the horizon. So I think one great thing that we're going to be seeing this spring is a new vaccine that has less strict storage requirements. And it's a one-dose vaccine. So this is really going to allow us to expand our footprint to get vaccine out in an equitable manner to those who may have special access considerations, such as transient populations or rural communities. Yeah, and I'll just maybe close by saying that vaccination really is still one tool, albeit a very important tool, but it is one tool in our toolbox to controlling this pandemic. So even after vaccination, we definitely need to continue to think through the importance of masks, social distancing, and hand washing as we move forward this year. It's really only when we have more information about the longevity of this vaccine and its protection that we can start to ease back on some of those actions. So really wanting to focus us to not let our guard down and to continue to protect our friends and family through those other mechanisms. We know that community engagement is really vital to our implementation success. And so just as Lily said, I would really encourage you to continue to have conversations in your community to combat vaccination hesitancy and share the information you'll hear about today. Each one of you is truly a vaccine ambassador, and we're looking to you as partners for our success. So
love it. We're all in this together.
We are.
We're going to be actually, later on in this webcast, we'll have Brooke Abbott, who is going to chat with us about vaccine hesitancy and vaccine equity. So we're going to keep expanding on that too. And thank you, Dr. Ruth, for bringing that up. And also, yes, we need to continue being vigilant. We've hung in there for a long time. We've got to keep wearing the masks. We've got to keep hand washing. We're almost on the other side. Thanks to the great work of folks to get this vaccine up and running. And thank you, Dr. Ruth, for all that you do in service to our country. We are so grateful.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me today. It was a real pleasure.
Of course. Well, now Dr. Ruth did an amazing job kicking off our webinar. It's time for us to get a little bit more specific to autoimmune diseases and the COVID-19 vaccine. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Matlubian, who is a professor of medicine in the Division of Rheumatology at the University of California, San Francisco. As a physician scientist, Dr. Matlubian brings decades of experience in studying immune response to viruses. Dr. Matlubian, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so thrilled to have you here.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Of course. Well, today I know that our audience is so excited to jump right in and hear more about the COVID-19 vaccine and how it specifically is going to interact with autoimmune patients, because we heard from Dr. Ruth all about, the mRNA mechanisms of action and how that is working for our general population. But now it's time to drill down and talk about it specifically for autoimmune patients. So my first question, and really the question that's the topic of the hour of this webinar, are you recommending that your patients living with autoimmune diseases get the COVID-19 vaccine?
Absolutely. So I think there's a general consensus among organizations that are autoimmune disease specific ones, such as the American College of Rheumatology, the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, and the International Organization for the Study of Inflammatory Bowel Disease, as well as National Psoriasis Foundation. All of them have recommended that individuals with autoimmune diseases should get the COVID-19 vaccines that are currently been approved, which include the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Keep in mind that these are dead or inactivated vaccines. They're non-replicating, they're not infectious, and I'm sure Dr. Ruth has talked about that. So they are okay to be taken by individuals with autoimmune diseases, similar to the same recommendations that are made for the seasonal influenza vaccines.
Yes, that is so helpful. Thank you for that, for giving some context there and just so directly answering that question. And that's something that we are hearing from a lot of our partners in the autoimmune space, that yes, you should get vaccinated for COVID-19. So another question we've been hearing a lot is, will the vaccine be less effective for patients taking an immunosuppressant medication?
This is an excellent question that's on the minds of patients as well as their physicians. And unfortunately, there aren't much data specifically for the COVID-19 vaccines that are currently available, because in the clinical trials that were done, not many individuals with autoimmune diseases were included. For example, in the Pfizer phase 3 trial, there were about 19,000 people in the vaccine group and 19,000 people in the placebo group. But among each of those groups, there were only 60 people with what they labeled as autoimmune rheumatic diseases. There were no one with inflammatory bowel disease, and there were no individuals with multiple sclerosis or psoriasis mentioned. So we don't have data to inform us about what happens in individuals who have autoimmune disease and then get these vaccines, and what's the effect of their immunosuppressive medications on these specific COVID vaccines. But as a group, we have a great amount of data from studies done in individuals on immunosuppressive medications who have gotten the influenza vaccine. And many of these studies have been done actually in individuals with IBD, as well as with rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. So we can extrapolate from those studies, as well as from what we understand how the immunosuppressive medications work, to make some informed recommendations regarding the effects of immunosuppressive medications on vaccine responses. Keep in mind that the studies are not perfect. They usually measure what's called neutralizing antibodies to the influenza vaccine. They seldom measure the other arm of the immune system that's activated by the vaccines and provides protection against infection, and those are the T cell responses. The other caveat with those studies is that they don't really measure whether individuals who were on immunosuppressive medications and got the flu vaccine had more influenza infections in that season, or when they got infected, they had more severe disease. So what they're measuring are surrogates for responses to the vaccines without really measuring if there was a significant impact on the disease outcome. So with that in mind, and with all those caveats, I think we can divide the immunosuppressive medications into 4 groups. The first group is the ones that people who are on them should not worry about them affecting the response to the vaccine. So, and these include, prednisone in usually doses that are less than 20 milligram a day, hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil, sulfasalazine, leflunomide or Reva, Cellcept or Myfortic, azathioprine, also known as Imuran. Among this group that people should not worry about are most of the biologic self-injectable agents. These include the TNF inhibitors, such as Humira, Enbrel, Remicade, Cimzia, and Simponi, that many individuals with rheumatoid arthritis or IBD are on. They include the class of IL-6 inhibitors, including Actemra and Kevzara, the IL-1 inhibitors, which include anakinra, Ilaris, and Rilonacept, the IL-17 inhibitors that many individuals with psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis on, which includes Taltz, Cosentyx, and Cilic. The other medications such as Skyrizi and Termfia, Stelara, Entyvio, which many individuals with IBD are on. For people with MS, there are medications that are within the S1P inhibitor family, and they include the fingolimod, ozanimod, and sponimod. There are calcineurin inhibitors such as cyclosporin A and tacrolimus such as Prograf. So if you are on these medications, studies have shown that they really do not affect the response to vaccines, again, influenza vaccine, and we don't expect them to affect the response to the COVID vaccine. So you should continue taking them and do not take a break. Then there's a second group of medications that do affect the immune response to the vaccines, and the timing of the vaccine relative to the medication is important. And there's one medication in that group, and that's abatacept or Orencia, that people with rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis could be on. So abatacept is known to affect immune responses to vaccines. So the recommendation from the American College of Rheumatology, which I completely agree with, is that if you're taking the self-injectable form of abatacept, to hold your dose 1 week before the first dose of the COVID vaccine and hold it for another week following the first dose of the COVID vaccine. Abatacept doesn't really affect the booster response, so the recommendation is not to hold it for the second dose of the COVID vaccine. But if there are individuals out there who have stable disease and don't have a flare while they hold their abatacept, they may want to consider, in consultation with their physician, to hold it for the second dose as well, to maximize their immune response to this vaccine. People who are getting the IV abatacept, the recommendation is, because the medication is given every 4 weeks, to get the first dose of the COVID vaccine 4 weeks after your last infusion and delay your next infusion by 1 week. And this is only for the first dose. So of all the medications that people are on, the abatacept one is the more important one to play with the timing. So there's a third class of medications that many people are on, and these are what's called the B-cell depleting agents. They include rituximab, ocrelizumab, or Ocrevus. And people who have chronically been on this medication will not have the arm of the immune system that leads to this neutralizing antibodies that provides protection. So they should still get the vaccine, but keep in mind that if you're on these medications and you've been getting them frequently, you will not make neutralizing antibodies to the vaccine, and you will not be protected from getting that infection. So you might still get infected, and you might still be at the risk of transmitting it to your loved ones or people you live with. But at the same time, studies have shown that the vaccines also activate the other arm of the immune system called the T cells. And these cells are important in fighting the infection. So despite being on rituximab or Ocrevus, you should still get a vaccine, because you will be protected against getting a more severe infection if you get infected or have a worse outcome. So definitely should get the vaccine. There are some societies, such as the American College of Rheumatology and National MS Society, that recommend timing of the vaccine relative to infusions of rituximab. So you should talk to your doctor to see if they think that's important. This is, again, a controversial area. Some people think that it really doesn't matter. So you should get your vaccine whenever it's available. Yeah. So, and the last group of medications that are very common is a bit controversial. And the reason I'm saying it's controversial, because there are two schools of thought on whether to hold them or not to hold them. And I'm just going to preface it by saying that you should talk to your physician about it, and this should be a shared decision. And the two medications are methotrexate and a class of medications called JAK inhibitors, which includes Xeljanz, Olumiant, and Rinvoq. And these are used for rheumatoid arthritis as well as inflammatory bowel disease. So for the JAK inhibitors, there hasn't been that much data. The only one study has been done in people with influenza vaccine. And in that study, Xeljanz, which is a medication that was studied, did not affect the response to influenza vaccine. So there isn't that much concern regarding the effect of this medication on vaccine responses. And the International Organization for IBD has recommended that individuals who are on these medications to continue that medication. In contrast, the American College of Rheumatology has recommended to hold your medication for 1 week after vaccination. Again, there aren't that much data to support that point of view, and I would recommend people who are that class of medications to talk to their physician to see what's best for them, because whenever you hold your medication, there's a risk that you will have a flare. So lastly, methotrexate is the big one where there is a divergent of thought. So many people who have rheumatoid arthritis are on this medication. The International Organization for IBD does not recommend holding methotrexate if you're on it in relation to your vaccination. In the rheumatology world, multiple studies that have been done show that methotrexate doesn't really affect responses to influenza vaccines, but there are two studies from a Korean group that showed that if you hold methotrexate for 2 weeks after getting the influenza vaccine, people tended to have more antibody responses to influenza vaccine. But again, they didn't show whether having more antibodies made that those people didn't get infected as much or had less severe disease. So based on that, American College of Rheumatology has recommended that people who are methotrexate and this is a big and, have stable disease, to consider holding your methotrexate for 1 week after immunization. So they are making a compromise. The study was done with 2 weeks, but they're recommending 1 week. And there are a lot of caveats about this. A major one is that in one of the studies, people who held their methotrexate had more flares of their rheumatoid arthritis. So there's that risk. And the other issue is that the benefit of holding the methotrexate dependent on the dose. So people who were on higher dose had more benefit than people who were on the lower dose. But you can imagine if somebody is on a higher dose, they probably have more severe disease and they may have a higher chance of having a flare if they hold it. So the recommendation is this is a shared decision-making with your rheumatologist and with your physician. And you should talk to them and see if it's best for you to hold your medication. But I personally am not telling my patients to hold their medication because I'm a believer in the idea that don't let perfection to be the enemy of the good. And I think it's really important for people to get vaccinated as soon as possible. The whole idea of get them while they're hot, get your vaccine, don't delay them, because we don't know when it's going to be available next.
Yes, get them while they're hot. I love that. And I have to say, hats off to you for remembering all of those medication names. It is so impressive. And I appreciate that you really went through each one because we've had so many questions coming in from folks who registered for our newscast and who did want to hear about this and how their specific medication could potentially interact with the vaccine or if it would impact the vaccine's efficacy. So thank you so much for walking through that. And so now I just have one final question for you. Are there any concerns that the vaccine could cause a flare or autoimmune reaction? This is another big question we've been getting from our viewers.
Yes, it's an important question that unfortunately we don't have direct answer for because, as I mentioned, in many of the studies of these vaccines, people with autoimmune diseases were not included, so we don't know. So what I want to say is that we need to study this, and there are multiple studies going on nationwide and internationally. For example, my institution, UCSF, is conducting the study. Talk to your doctor, and if there's any studies that you can get involved in, that would be fantastic, because all it requires is to fill out questionnaires regarding your symptoms before and after vaccination, and that would be really helpful. But with that in mind, again, extrapolating from influenza vaccine, which is a different platform, as Dr. Ruth has explained, compared to this mRNA-based vaccines. Studies that are done in rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and IBD do not find increase in flares after vaccination. And the best studies are done when a group of individuals with one specific autoimmune disease gets vaccinated and another group gets the placebo, basically a saline injection. And that's really important to compare those two groups because, as many of you who have an autoimmune disease know, autoimmune diseases tend to flare sporadically. So it's really difficult to say whether it's related to the vaccine itself or it just happened to be random. So So multiple organizations, including the International Organization for IBD, have gotten groups together to make recommendations, and they specifically said that they don't have any concerns regarding flares. The American College of Rheumatology has said the same thing. The National MS Society actually put out a very thorough statement saying that keep in mind that people might get fevers with these vaccines, as is true of other vaccines, and fevers are known to sometimes cause worsening of chronic MS symptoms. But these should be very transient. As the fever goes away, people's symptoms should go back to baseline. But it's important to realize that the benefits of getting vaccinated outweigh the risks of having a flare, because getting the actual COVID-19 infection could be worse and could exacerbate underlying autoimmune diseases even more, because it's a much stronger immune response. So we don't know for sure. We need to study this, but based on what we know, we don't expect it to cause increased in flares.
Well, thank you. That is really helpful. You've truly tackled some of our most pressing questions today. And I also love that pitch and shout out for folks to get involved in studies, because this is how we get these answers. And it's so important. So I do, for any of you out there who have gotten the vaccine or are planning to get the vaccine, do ask your physician if there is an opportunity for you to be enrolled in a study so that we can collect that data. Well, thank you again, Dr. Matloubian, for joining us. We're so lucky to have you.
My pleasure. This is great. I hope it's beneficial to individuals with autoimmune diseases. It's hard, taking medications and also worry about getting infected and how the medications affect vaccine responses. So there are a lot of issues that people are rightfully concerned about.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us. And now, from one physician to another, I am thrilled to share that we have Dr. Clayton, an internationally recognized leader in many fields. Dr. Clayton is a Craig Weaver Professor of Pediatrics Law and Health Policy at Vanderbilt University. She is currently co-chair of the Report Review Committee of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and in that role has overseen most of their reports on COVID-19. Dr. Clayton, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to have you here.
Oh, well, I am really pleased to be here.
And I have to say it, I love your purple blazer and your purple glasses. They match, and I just think it's fabulous.
Well, you got to do something to, to make yourself smile.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. That's why I'm wearing I said this morning, I'm wearing my sparkle or my glam, my vaccine glam we're going to, talk about the vaccine today.
Great. There you go.
All right. So let's jump right in. You have a really deep and impressive expertise in research, ethics, and safety. And so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the COVID-19 vaccines and their safety profiles.
I think actually extraordinary care has been taken to do this. And even though it's been on an accelerated path, nonetheless, the companies that have been involved have really worked very hard to meet regulatory and ethical standards. I think one of the reasons it seems so fast is that usually when you do a drug or a vaccine, you do an early trial to see if it's safe, and then a smaller trial to see another trial to see if it's effective, and then a big trial to test both those things. What they did here was sort of do them all together. And so what would ordinarily have been a 1 or 2 year process, they were able to do much more quickly. And it's been, really, it's been very impressive.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And that's very much in line with what Dr. Ruth from the CDC was saying, that it happened quickly, but there was still so much thought put into and consideration put into ensuring that these are safe. So the first 2 approved vaccines by Moderna and Pfizer are 95% effective. But the most recently or soon to be approved vaccine, J&J, is only about 70% effective. So what are your thoughts on this? Because people are wondering, is it still worth getting, or should I wait until I can get the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine? What's the thought there?
You should get any vaccine you should get, or you can get. If someone will put it in your arm, do it. But I think one of the things that we need to be clear about is that, first of all, the J&J vaccine, the 70% efficacy is against preventing all disease. It's actually much more effective for preventing severe disease or death. So it's actually quite effective in that regard. And frankly, the efficacy of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are quite uncommon in vaccine history. So to think about it, the comparison is flu vaccine, which from year to year is often only about 50% effective. So the J&J vaccine is actually quite effective, and it's really effective against the bad things, against being on a ventilator or dying. And so I would say, if you can get it, I would get it, because it's a whole lot better than getting COVID, a whole lot better than getting COVID. So I totally endorse that. It may be possible to do J&J is doing a trial to see if a booster will increase efficacy. That'll be interesting to see. But right now, just on the basis of what we have, if you can get the J&J vaccine, you should get it.
I love it. So get whatever vaccine is offered to you.
Right.
Yes. So that leads me, we're talking about vaccinations. People, eventually we want to get to this critical point where what we're hearing, it's called herd immunity. We're hearing it all over the news everywhere. It's a big buzzword these days. So could you tell us more about what exactly herd immunity means and what would need to happen for us to be able to achieve it?
Sure. One of the reasons that COVID is spreading so rapidly right now is that it's actually a pretty effective spreader, and most people aren't immune. So if I have it, then if I run into somebody else who isn't immune, they can get it. But if everybody I see already is already immune, I can have the disease, I can be very contagious, but the fact of the matter is no one else will get it because everybody else is already immune. So that's what herd immunity is. And the level of herd immunity you have to have is directly correlated with how infectious it is. The most infectious disease we know of right now is measles. And measles is extremely infectious. And so that's the reason. So to get herd immunity for something like measles, you have to have 95% of the population has to be immune. That's extraordinarily high. For COVID, it's less infectious than that. So the projections right now are 70 or 80%. But here's an important point. Some of these new variants that are coming around, like the one from the UK and the one from South Africa, are actually more infectious than the ones we have here now. And so what we really want to do is get as many people immunized right now and to get the herd immunity as high as they can to slow down all the COVID. And so to prevent us from still getting really pretty good herd immunity if 70 or 80% of people are immune, and to prevent the really more infectious ones from getting widespread. So then we have to have herd immunity at a much higher level. So it all turns on whether the people who you are exposed to or whom you expose are immune and how infectious it is. But if everybody around you is immune, you can't spread it. That's what we want.
That was a great explanation. I've been hearing it so much. And so it was good to hear you put it into context. And 70 to 80% people, we've got to get out there and get those shots in arms and get vaccinated. Take whichever one they give you, right?
Right.
So you're also a pediatrician. On the long list of job titles you have, which is very impressive, you are a pediatrician. And so what information do you want children and their parents, especially children living with autoimmune diseases, to know about the COVID-19 vaccine?
So the thing I want to say about that is that we haven't started testing the vaccines in children. That is common, that we wait to do kids until we do adults. But it's important for the parents of those children to get immunized, because we realize that those children might be more susceptible to COVID and they might be more likely to have adverse side effects. And so the people who are caring for these kids ought to get immunized themselves. And in fact, some states like ours are really reaching out to parents who have children who are seriously ill to make sure that they get the vaccine so that they don't make the kids sick, because the kids themselves can't get it, but certainly the adults can. And if they have the opportunity, they should.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great insight. And I think there hasn't been a whole lot of conversation happening that I've seen surrounding the vaccine and kids, or there haven't been a lot of people able to answer questions. So thank you for speaking to that. So we have been taking questions that came in as folks registered for the webcast. And I wanted to actually call out one in particular that somebody wrote in, and they shared, my fiance and I both work on the front lines, but we're nervous to get the COVID vaccine since we want to start a family soon. What do you recommend?
Do it.
Do it.
So, I mean, that's sort of silly, but I want to say there are a couple of things to say there. I mean, first of all, there is some misinformation going around saying that the vaccine may affect fertility. To my knowledge, there is no evidence of that whatsoever, either in humans or in animal models, or any reason to think that's the case. So that's one thing. The other thing to say is that increasingly, the recommendations are coming out that even pregnant women, who also are a group who tend not to be in trials early on, the recommendations are coming out saying, if you are pregnant and if you have the chance to get the vaccine, that you should talk about it with your doctor, because it may be safe and effective. We don't have the data yet. There's even some early evidence coming out that if a woman gets the vaccine, that she will pass on some immunity to her unborn child. So, we are moving quickly here, and we don't always have the data that we absolutely want. But there's no reason to think that if you are a healthy young adult and you are, and you have access to the vaccine because you're a healthcare provider, just do it. I mean, it will protect you, and it will also, if you become, there's also evidence that if you become pregnant and you get infected, that it leads to adverse birth outcomes, prematurity, and more healthcare problems for the woman. So again, I would just say that on balance, it's pretty clear that if you are a healthy young adult working on the front line, you are at risk of getting this infection. And particularly if you're planning to get pregnant sometime soon, you better get it now. I mean, you may be able to get it also when you're pregnant, but there's fewer data about that. But boy, I would get it right now.
Well, that's so helpful, Dr. Clayton. We really appreciate that. And for those of you who do, if you are pregnant and you do decide to get the vaccine, do look for those registries out there. We've been talking about that with Dr. Ruth and Dr. Madlubian, that it is so valuable to share your data and so that we can begin to track this and we can begin to understand, the vaccine within different populations. And so again, you can really make an impact there. So we definitely encourage you to do that. Dr. Clayton, you are fabulous, and we are so lucky to have had you on our newscast today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insight with our community. We are so grateful for all that you shared today.
Well, I can't tell you, I mean, I love doing this stuff, and I'm so happy to share information. And if it saves even one person from getting this awful infection, then that is time well spent.
Well, I think there's been a lot of time well spent then today, because I bet you've saved a lot of people. So thank you again, Dr. Clayton. And now we are going to move into the next part of our programming. We've heard from 3 incredible physicians on the COVID-19 vaccine. And now we're going to hear from Brooke Abbott, who is the creator of the Crazy Creole Mommy Chronicles and the co-founder of IBD Moms. Brooke is a phenomenal advocate and IBD champion, often representing the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, the Digestive Disease National Coalition on Capitol Hill. Brooke, thank you so much for being here today. It is so good to see you virtually.
It's so good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So let's just jump right in and tackle vaccine equity. You and I have been chatting about this. I certainly think that the IBD community has been chatting about this, the autoimmune community, and for that matter, our country and our world. And so can you tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing and hearing regarding COVID-19 vaccine equity?
Well, I'm on the West Coast. I'm specifically in Los Angeles. So we are in a bit of a pickle right now. We've got, a rollout that wasn't necessarily clear, and there really wasn't any guidance or equity when the rollout happened. All over the nation, but specifically for us, because we were hit very hard recently with COVID-19. And so you had mostly people in the medical field who were trying to get their vaccines. And then there was the whole miscommunication about people with autoimmune diseases versus people with people who are over 65, and then people who are 75 and older. And then we're also very close to other counties, and Los Angeles County itself has it's very large, but it has its own way of doing things. And so the surrounding counties were definitely doing their own thing as well. So it was all very confusing. And, there wasn't a lot of education given out to a lot of the seniors and disabled people that were able to get their vaccines after the medical community could get theirs. What was frustrating to me, I tried to help my grandmother navigate the website, and I consider myself pretty technologically savvy, and it was incredibly frustrating. To a point where my 11-year-old was standing by, they're always like, well, clearly you don't know what you're doing. Let the Gen Zer get in here. And he was still like, this thing keeps refreshing. It won't let me do this. It won't let me do that. And so I can only imagine what it was like for people who are not as technologically savvy. Also, there was a lot of misinformation on the internet about the vaccines. And, we know that a lot of our parents and grandparents are now on Facebook. And so they're reading stuff and they're sharing stuff, and they are not necessarily deciphering between real information and some of these clickbait sites. And, once you click on one of those sites or click one of those memes, you're just trafficked all this information that is very similar to that. I am very fortunate to have older women and men in my life who are very educated about vaccines and, are not necessarily scared or have apprehensions. But I know that a lot of the people in my church community, in my neighborhood, and just in my overall ethnic community as a whole, we're having a lot of questions and a lot of concerns. And I saw them predominantly when my grandmother posted that she took her picture, she got her, her shot. Clearly I'm influencing her.
I love it.
My mom took a picture of her and they posted it on Facebook. But when I saw the comments, it made me sad because there were so many older people who were petrified of what was in the vaccine, how the vaccine was rolled out, who was behind the vaccine. Most people were scared of the speed of the vaccine. And one thing that really kind of frustrates me about the last administration was there wasn't a lot of education coming out saying, like, this is why it's coming out so fast, because we've put all the money that we haven't put behind anything ever in life behind this to get a hold of this so that we can move on and focus on the other diseases that we need to tackle. but with the underlying fears and the generations, decades upon decades of misinformation about medicine and science within the Black community, the actual, well, it's a disconnect. That's what it is. It's a disconnect because for a long time, Black Americans were forced to take care of their own. They were, I mean, I have one parent who was born in a segregated hospital. I'm 37 years old. So it's not like, we're 2 or 3 generations away from medical inequities.
Absolutely. And I know this is something we're going to dig into a little bit more. And I'm just thank you for touching on so many different, when we say inequity, that can mean a lot of different things. And you did such a beautiful job touching on how this is impacting the elderly, the disabled, ethnic communities. I think that there's across the board, admittedly, this could have gone a lot differently for a lot of different reasons. I mean, even you were talking about the technology piece. Even I, here in Massachusetts and living with, I haven't shared this on this newscast yet, but I also have a few different autoimmune diseases. And that's how Brooke and I know each other. We're both members of the IBD community. Yes. And I was looking to see, all right, we're starting phase 2. So who's included? And I honestly still don't know. I was looking at this yesterday. I still don't know if I'm included in phase 2 because the language is too vague. It's not particularly clear. The site's crashing. So a lot of issues there. But one thing that I did want to touch on, and that you just started to address towards the end of that last question, is that many members of our autoimmune community are Black and brown women specifically, because 75% of the people with autoimmune diseases are women who have had unjust encounters with our medical system. And so would you be able to speak to some of the history here that has fostered this mistrust and thereby is impacting vaccine hesitancy?
Absolutely. There was a brilliant movie made by HBO about the story of Henrietta Lacks. And I think that her story is very poignant because it wasn't centuries ago. Her cells were used to create a lot of the vaccines that we enjoy. And her cells were used, and not only was she not compensated, but she wasn't even recognized. And she was not asked. They were taken during, basically she had cancer, and they were taken during her medical exams. And they were used, and they have helped so many people. But for so long, her family, didn't even know that she was a part of these scientific miracles. And then you have the Tuskegee experiment, where Black men were actually given a disease and then not allowed to be treated for it because they were studying them, and they didn't even tell them. And once, the vaccine for that disease came out, they weren't given it. And this actually ended in the 1970s when someone blew the whistle. So you've got people who know that for so long, Black Americans have not been treated humanely in any sense of the form. The systemic racism in this country is so deep that we can't even begin to find ideas to figure out how to unravel it, because it's everywhere. It's subtly, it's financially impactful, it's emotionally impactful. There's this idea that Black women, I laugh because I'm such a wimp. So it's funny to me that Black women are, because, we've had to endure generational trauma of things. We scientifically apparently can handle pain more than other people. And so you see that sometimes when you're in the hospital and you're, I don't care if you're an educated patient, I don't care what your financial status is or your social status is. I know people from the poorest of poor to the richest of rich who have literally not been listened to by nurses and doctors, who have not been given adequate pain medication, who have been, pricked several times with needles because apparently we can take it and it's no big deal, who have been told that there's no way that they could have the disease or the symptoms that they're having. There's just all these little things that, after a while you get exhausted. It's exhausting. And I feel like if I wasn't an advocate with all the diseases that I have going on and all that I have to do, and I have a son who also has chronic conditions, I don't know that I would be as trusting if I wasn't as educated and I didn't know the people behind, some of these medical advances, and knew such great doctors. Because when you do have a series back to back of bad experiences, you get shut off. And we also have to remember that it wasn't long ago that Black Americans could only go to certain hospitals, could only see certain doctors, and some doctors weren't specialists or weren't able to practice that specialty, weren't allowed to, even some Black doctors weren't even allowed to be certified for certain surgeries. And so then you had Black Americans who were not getting treated at all. So there is a generational mistrust. And when it comes to vaccines, we haven't seen much representation in clinical trials. And it's a double-edged sword, because companies and labs are not reaching out and speaking to communities of color. They are not going the extra step. There are a lot of nonprofits that are not taking that extra step to reach those communities. And then you have people in my community, I can speak for my community specifically, who feel that they're being experimented on and don't have the education to make, the decision on being a part of a clinical trial, and are also seeing that there is no representation. So it's like, I don't see anybody there, so I don't really trust it, but I don't want to do it myself because I'm scared, because I'm not sure what could happen. So there's a lot of conversations that need to be had. There's a lot of information that needs to be had. And I think it starts with, we have all these amazing scientists and doctors of color and advocates of color. And there were so many that worked on this particular vaccine rollout. And I know that now, they're being utilized to have conversations and they're on television, but they're not in the churches, they're not in the barbershops, they're not in the hairstylists or in the hair salons. My mom's a hairstylist. I know for sure that Black folks get their best information from the barbershop and the hair salon and the church. That's just, this is where we have gotten together. And then those conversations are taken to, dinners and meetups with our cousins and our aunts and our uncles. And that's how those conversations go. It's building trust within the community, with folks from the community. And no one's really taken the time to put an effort in that type of rollout. And it's going to take money, it's going to take time, and it's going to take the want. You're going to want, you have to want to make this real and make it equitable. And if you're not doing that, then no, you're not going to find the money or the time or the people. And that's unfortunate, because this thing is just going to keep spiraling if we are not educating people to the gravity of what happens if we don't vaccinate most of the population, and if we are not in some sort of herd immunity by the end of 2021.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, so much to unpack there that you just covered. And I couldn't agree more. I feel like we need to take this segment of the newscast and we need to broadcast it to everybody who is working in this field and working on distribution, because it's absolutely critical that we do, just as you said, that we are really taking a boots on the ground approach. So what would you say to any of those women watching who may be hesitant about getting the COVID-19 vaccine, especially women of color?
Yeah. It's so easy for me to say, like, trust the science, right? That's like super easy to say. As a mom, it's important for me to find information, and I know that it's important to the women who are watching this to find the information, but it's where do you find the information, right? There are some really great resources. I can speak specifically to the IBD community, but and to the mom community, but I know, for sure, checking out all the IBD advocates who are associated with IBD Social Circle, and like I always promote her because she's like the smartest person I know, honestly. Like, I love her so much. But Amber Treskov about IBD is genius, and she always has information. It's fact-based, it's vetted, it's cited. It just makes sense, and she's a mom and she gets it. And so finding advocates like her and doctors who are really researching. I know Dr. Rutland, he is a pulmonary specialist, but he really breaks it down for people, and those are the people that I like to follow. Those are the people that I like to get information from, because they're speaking to you in a way that you understand. They're not trying to talk over you. They're not trying to give you information that's too much. They're literally giving you what you need to know and what you need not to feel comfortable. I want people to give me information that will allow me to make an educated decision. So, about IBD, Dr. Rutland, Dr. Rubin is really great. The Crohn's and Colitis Foundation is putting out a lot of information. Like, there's all these people, they're all on Twitter, and they're all on there, and they have information that you can easily read. And if you can't understand it, then keep asking questions. But what I hope that people are going to start doing is not taking the meme or the video that they see on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter that kind of validates their worst fears or validates, their idea, whether it's positive or negative. This is an important moment. This is our moment to really take the reins over our health and follow through and take control. Getting vaccinated, beating COVID-19 is our moment. This is our moment to take control and make us all safe. And we have that opportunity. So I'm going to ask everybody to do just a little bit of work, take a little bit of time and research. And it's more than going to the sites that you normally go to. It's, it's more than watching some YouTube. It's more than that. It's finding people who have the actual information and finding the people that you can ask questions to who aren't going to give you trivial answers. But find us on Twitter, because we're all having that conversation, and all of your fears and your concerns are valid. I want people to understand that. And I hope that doctors and scientists are understanding that too, that people's fears are valid.
Absolutely.
Because of experience and because of what they're hearing. So we got to hone in, and we've got to come together, and we've got to ask questions, and we've got to research.
I love it. I think that's the perfect way to end this segment, to do the research, do the work, and support one another in answering those questions. Brooke, thank you so much, as always, for your incredible insight and for really illuminating how history is impacting what's happening with our vaccine rollout today and what we can really do to address that. So I do encourage all of you to please follow Brooke and follow, as she said, Amber on social media. They are collectively IBD moms, and they are brilliant. And I am just honored to have the opportunity to know them. So thank you so much for joining us, Brooke.
Thank you for having me. This topic is so important, and I appreciate you guys really doing this.
Thanks, Brooke. Well, now we've heard about vaccine equity. It's time to wrap up our newscast with the amazing Anna Lagasse, who is an autoimmune arthritis advocate and has received the COVID-19 vaccine. Anna is an advocate and healthcare strategy and development professional living in Boston. She was diagnosed with systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis at age 11. She uses her expertise as a patient to consult with healthcare startups, pharma companies, and other healthcare orgs, collaborating to incorporate the patient voice into healthcare design, technology, and policy reform. Anna, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm just going to jump right in because you are our final interview, and we had a lot of amazing people today, so I can't say that we've saved the best for last, but you're pretty amazing. And what I'm really excited about is that you got the COVID-19 vaccine, and I have some very serious vaccine envy. I'm coining it, #vaccine envy. So tell me, how did you make the decision to get the vaccine as a person living with autoimmune diseases?
I mean, I feel like a lot of people, I started watching, vaccine development from its inception, right? And, I think one of my biggest concerns at the beginning was, would we end up with a vaccine that has some sort of live virus in it, right? Because that's sort of an automatic disqualifier for most of us with autoimmune diseases. So as soon as I sort of, was following the science, following, this mRNA, but knowing that there wasn't going to be live virus in it, that was pretty much it for me. My decision was more or less made right up front that as soon as this is available to me, I'm going to get it. Having said that, as soon as both Moderna and Pfizer had gotten their emergency use authorizations from the FDA, we had a lot more public-facing data than we had previously. Talked to all of my doctors. So for me, not all, but for me, most importantly, my rheumatologist, cardiologist, and PCP. And all of them felt very strongly that I get it as soon as it was available to me, versus waiting for any sort of, medication specific guidance, right? Because, as much as we all sort of fall under this autoimmune umbrella, most of us are on different medications, right? So we have different considerations. I'm very fortunate to have a PCP that is very, very proactive as far as vaccinating me for everything, not just my annual flu shot, HPV, Hep A, Hep B, both, pneumonia vaccines. And at no point in the last 5, 6, 7 years have we ever held my infusion or my treatment for a vaccine. So I felt very comfortable making this decision to ultimately say, I don't have guidelines in front of me. I'm going to get it when it's offered. I know a lot of this is because right around the time that, approvals were coming out and state plans were coming out, I live in Massachusetts, and as the plan is written, it's really unclear where autoimmune patients and patients on immune weakening drugs truly lie in this phased approach. So at that point, I was just sort of like, whenever I'm presented the opportunity, I'm going to get it, which is what I did. And sure enough, I've had first and second dose, and maybe last week or the week before, my rheumatologist reached out with the drug specific guidelines. Now, all things considered, as far as what they're recommending, as far as, holding your infusion a week or whatever, I only missed it by a week what they were saying, and talked to my rheumatologist about this, and her thoughts were, this is going to change again when we have more data. These are very sort of precautionary guidelines that manufacturers and other organizations are putting out. They'll likely change in 6 months when we have more data. So she was just like, I think we made the right decision. You got it, as soon as it was available to you. And also, holding medications comes with its own set of risks, right? Do we let my arthritis potentially come out of this well-controlled state that it's in when our medical system is completely, to the brink, to the max? So it's a balancing act, but ultimately I feel good about the decision that I made, even not having all of the data that, ideally we would all have when we're making this sort of decision.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because that's much of our life with autoimmune conditions is living in the unknown, and you have to make the best decision that is, there's always going to be benefit and risk, and you have to make the decision with which you believe is going to be the most benefit to you, right? Um,
I still believe that and firmly that the risk of not knowing how my body would be able to fend off COVID-19, somebody who has a risk of, or not a risk, but a history of serious infections requiring hospitalization. My original diagnosis is systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis. Going back and going through my medical records, I always talk about something that happened to me as a child when I had really severe pericarditis to the extent that I ended up in acute congestive heart failure. I was put in a medically induced coma for a period of several weeks so my body could heal, and other, organ systems were at risk of failure. And as I've gone through and pulled all of that and consulted with some of, my doctors today, all of them feel really strongly that as a child, I've already experienced a cytokine storm. So for me, at least, this was a no-brainer. There's a lot of risk over here and what I believe to be a much smaller level of risk over here as far as getting a vaccine versus taking my chances with, any sort of potential COVID infection.
Yep. I think that's an outstanding way to balance it out and look at it, and something that a lot of the folks who are watching are experiencing right now. And so I appreciate your candor in sharing that. So now you got the vaccine. Tell us, what was your experience like? Did you experience any side effects?
Yeah, so I mean, I want to say up front that my experience was really intense, but it was more like emotionally intense to get it. So I worked for an academic medical center in Boston. We had a really robust supply at the beginning of this rollout. And at the time that it was offered to me, it was actually New Year's Eve day of 2020. So this is really, really early in the rollout. But at the time, we had already vaccinated all of our providers who were taking care of COVID patients, all of our providers who weren't. And I shouldn't just say providers, we're talking about anybody within the organization that was patient facing, anyone who interacts with patients, whether it's clinicians, housekeeping, food services, everybody. And even after all of that, even after everybody had elected to get theirs, they still had supply, they still had appointments. So I had gotten an email that morning and hesitated, truly hesitated. I felt like I was cutting the line. I really did, especially in Massachusetts, where the guidelines are so wishy-washy for autoimmune patients. And it was actually a colleague of mine who picked up the phone and was like, "Are you getting your vaccine?" I was like, "I don't really know." She's like, "Anybody needs to go in and get their vaccine. You're not skipping the line. We need shots in arms. Get in there." And so I did. And, the actual experience was really intense. I go into our vaccine clinic. It's my colleagues, it's my friends, it's people who have been on the front lines for almost a year now. And people, the energy is incredible. Everybody is so happy. There's like palpable hope for once. And so I sat down in the chair and just immediately started crying, perfectly normal reaction to have. But, from a more practical standpoint, as I'm sitting in that chair crying, this sort of intake for having your vaccine is a lot different, right, than just getting your, flu shot every year. You're going to get asked about your medical history, specifically about your history of allergies or allergic reactions. And then you're going to consent in a way, in a very sort of heavy-handed, this drug is approved, but it's under an emergency use authorization. It's a different thing. So I think if you're getting the vaccine, be prepared for it to feel a little different than your average flu jab every year. And so, I got my shot. I had to wait 30 minutes instead of the standard 15, just because I have a history of drug allergies. I'm not contraindicated. It is all just like abundance of caution. So if you're made to wait 30 minutes, it's really not a big deal. It's just to make sure everybody stays safe. For my first shot, 0 side effects, to the point where I was just like, oh gosh, is this working? Are we okay? My second shot, I started experiencing pretty severe side effects within 6 hours of that second dose. So I had a really intense headache, very light sensitive, muscle pain, joint pain, nausea, upset stomach, diarrhea, not great. But it really only lasted 24 hours. And by day 2, I felt fine. I was back to running, sort of doing my usual thing. And the thing that I keep trying to tell everybody, especially healthy folks who aren't used to taking, different drugs or treatments and going down for a full day, is if the side effects were 10, 20 times worse than they were, I still would have gotten it. No question. 24 hours of feeling pretty lousy, still worth it. Still worth it.
Thank you, Anna. This is I love your honesty. And as Dr. Ruth said at the beginning of our newscast, if you're experiencing some of those side effects, it's okay. That means it's working. That means that your body is learning how to fight COVID. And so it is a positive thing. And I should caveat that if you don't have any side effects, that's okay too. The vaccine is but it is often a sign if you are experiencing side effects that it's working. So, thank you, Anna, for sharing that and for being honest. And so that people know what to expect, because when we know what to expect, it does help us feel a little bit more comfortable and less surprised when something, may happen.
That's the biggest question I get asked from people is side effects. And I tell everybody the same thing, that I was thrilled. I was thrilled to know that my immune system, of all immune systems on the planet, was doing what it was supposed to do, and it was mounting a response. I think I would have been, even knowing the science, even knowing that you can still be mounting that, immune response in the absence of side effects. And we're specifically seeing that in older populations, 55, 65, 75 plus are having a lot less severe side effects than younger folks, which I think is important to keep in mind. But that's, it's the number one question I get asked by folks. And I try to be honest, because I think, I work from home right now, and I got my vaccine on a Thursday, and Friday, I really had to take it easy to the best of my ability and be in communication with colleagues about sort of what my expectations were for the day. And I think that's important for folks to be able to plan and sort of juggle whatever responsibilities they have, whether it's work, childcare, elder care, whatever it is. Obviously everybody has different priorities that they have to balance outside of just the general sort of risk and cost benefit analysis of getting the vaccine itself.
Yeah. Okay, so, and I feel like you've alluded to this a bit throughout, but I'd love to know what your advice is to all of the autoimmune patients who are tuning in but are unsure about getting the vaccine.
So it's really hard, right, to give specific advice, because, like I said, we all fall under this autoimmune umbrella, but our situations are so different. I'm on a biologic medication. That's different than being on other biologics or Rituxan or methotrexate. There's a lot of different considerations. What I would say, though, is now is the time to get sure. You don't want to wait until your number comes up in line in whatever state you live in. You don't want to wait until that last minute to get in touch with your doctors to make that decision. Interestingly enough, when I reached out to my rheumatologist, she told me that our specialty pharmacist at the hospital was really the one tracking guidelines, not her, because she has more of this macro view of all of these different biologics that are getting administered to our patients across, a variety of practice areas. So I talked to my rheum, I talked to her. I talked to my cardiologist. A lot of folks listening today probably have comorbidities from their disease. So, you might have more than one doctor to track down. Also PCPs, if you have a good one, they're also a lot closer to vaccine guidelines, believe it or not, than a lot of specialists are. And so that's a lot of things to wrangle, in advance of potentially being able to get the vaccine. So I think to the extent that you can be prepared for when your number comes up, now's the time to do it. And also, if your drug does require you holding a dose, delaying a dose, skipping a dose, extending, your infusion sort of cycle, you're going to want to plan that too, right? You can't just, not all of us can just get on a state website and make an appointment for next available. You know, there's some things that you have to consider. And of course, the practical aspect of planning for side effects with, you know, work, childcare, elder care, whatever it may be. And, you know, that's probably for folks who are leaning towards getting it. If you still feel really unsure and you feel unsure of the science, something that I have told a lot of my healthy friends who are going through their own risk calculus, it's probably a little bit different than ours, is that, you know, we can talk all day long about, you know, no, it wasn't rushed through, no steps were skipped, none of that, whatever. But to me, it's the size of these trials that are the most encouraging. And I think a lot of us with autoimmune diseases, we step back and we really think about the drugs that we've been on over the course of our disease and treatment. There have been so many more people in these trials than have ever been in any of the trials for the drugs we're taking every single day. And, you know, it's frustrating that folks with autoimmune diseases aren't represented in these broader clinical trials. But, you know, if you really step back and you think about your treatment, you think about, you know, some of the risks that we're all taking being on immune weakening drugs already. Those of us who were diagnosed before biologics existed and were in early clinical trials. Those of us who have been prescribed off-label use for drugs. It's helped me sort of frame how I think about this, that unfortunately, there's so little known about different aspects of autoimmune diseases that in just the course of treating our diseases, we've taken much bigger risks than this and continue to do so every day. That's not fair. It's not great. I wish that was not the reality for all of us right now. But I think if you can sort of frame your thinking around the science, the risk benefit, that's given me a lot of comfort to know that tens of thousands more people have been trialed for these vaccines than were ever trialed for any of the drugs that I've been on in the last 25 years. So I hope that sort of maybe giving some context around the risks that we're all thinking about taking right now might be helpful to some folks.
Unbelievably helpful. What a fabulous and powerful point. Seriously. I mean, it really helps you frame your thinking. This is a big decision for a lot of people. And so having all this information at hand and Anna, having your thought process and how you made this decision is so valuable for all of our patients and caregivers watching. So thank you for always showing up and always being an incredible advocate. You are honestly, Anna's one of the most brilliant advocates I know. I work with a lot of patients and advocates, and she just is a rock star. And we are lucky at AARDA to have the opportunity to work with her. So thank you for being here today, Anna.
Thanks, Lily. You know, nobody loves to talk about vaccines more than I do. So this is really, it's just great. And I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. And with that, that's a wrap. Thank you to Anna and all of our panelists who showed up today and joined our first ever autoimmune newscast on the COVID-19 vaccine. We were just so fortunate to have this amazing panel of government officials, physicians, and patient advocates. We covered so many topics, everything from the mRNA vaccine and their mechanism of action to what it means for those of us living with an autoimmune disease, herd immunity, the COVID-19 vaccine and fertility, and of course, vaccine equity. We're so grateful for our panelists for the time that they took to join us today, and thank all of you for tuning in. We recommend that you do always connect with your physician. We hope today helped you in making an informed decision about the vaccine, but it is always important to talk to your doctor about these types of decisions. And also you can head over to the AARDA website, aarda.org, to check out our COVID-19 Resource Center with the latest information on COVID-19 and the vaccine specifically designed for the autoimmune disease community. Thanks, everyone.